welcome back to the Director's Garage. I am your host and resident idiot, Michael, and today it is on. Big honkin' episode today, because at long last, I am pulling out the Dream Team. $23,000 in just headphones alone. But if you add in the system, the Chord M Scaler, the Hugo TT2, the Macintosh Pre, the Woo Audio WA5LE with its black caps and Takatsuki and Western Electric tubes, and then the Blue Hawaii, we are talking over $50,000 for this shootout, without including the $10,000 I spent on the Mac Pro desktop that I'm using as a source. This is the biggest lineup of flagship headphones this damaged brain could dream up. I mean, it's got to be damaged at these prices.
Help?
Speaking of insane costs, I'm gonna ask you to subscribe to the Director's Garage up front in this episode, because did I mention there's over 50K worth of gear here? Yeah, it's your subscriptions that help me deal with the insane costs of putting on a show like this one, and it only costs you a calorie or two to click the button, and like 70% of you don't. So it helps me grow the channel, and you guys have my sincere gratitude for doing it. So who are the contenders in today's hot category flagship shootout? Let's meet them right now. Come on. It's like the dating game.
Nice.
All right. First up, we have the Susvara. Now, I purchased the Susvara earlier this month to end my subscriber drive, my latest one, and then complete the Dream Team. Next up, we have the Abyss 1266. Now, I purchased these in December of last year, but I had to hold them for like 2 months before I could open them and show them off. It just never, the timing just didn't happen. Now, admittedly, these are missing a TC from the name, and that would mean that they have the latest and greatest driver in them, but no one has said that the TC sounds radically different from the 1266. It's a refinement of what the previous Abyss, this one, did. So, and it's the only one we have in-house. There you go. It's the one we're going to compare. After that, we go to the STAX. Now, the STAX S-009s I purchased for our 50th episode, and it's kind of the oddball out in this because it's the only electrostatic headphone in the shootout, but you can't deny its flagship street cred.
Thank you.
After that, we go to the Empyrean. Now, I bought the Empyrean as an open box around episode 35. And now there's the just released Elite, and I gotta confess, I was this close to pulling off a deal and securing one for this shootout the other day. We were just a little too far apart.
Oh, man.
What are you gonna do? And finally, there's the Utopia. Now, this is a flagship headphone with legendary performance. I spent the first 20 episodes of the Director's Garage building to this Utopia. It was a grail headphone at the time, and it still is today in a lot of ways.
Hello.
Now, today's shootout does not come without consequences. There will be cuts made. Headphones will be sold based on what we uncover here today. So let's talk biases, because I did have expectations going into this shootout, admittedly. First of all, I expected that the Abyss would lead most of the way. I thought that the Susvara would give the Abyss a run for its money, maybe best it, but probably not. And I expected that the STAX bass deficit would run it out of contention early. I thought that the Utopia would maybe contend, but never really lead. And I expected that the Empyrean would be obliterated early. Folks, almost none of that happened. As for what's missing from this shootout, well, I would have loved to have included the Dan Clark Audio Stealth and the new STAX SR-009s. The 9000 isn't due until like early October. I think both of those headphones would have been quite at home in this group. And then there's the latest Odyssey entries, the yet-to-be-released Carbon, and most notably the LCD5. Those would have been worthy additions to this flagship shootout. But I gotta be honest with you, I can't afford the LCD5 until they hit the used market, so I gotta play the hand I'm dealt. And it's time to deal, so let's draw! The stupidity knows no bounds. Okay. can I say? Okay. I want to begin with ergonomics because there is a clear winner here. And one of the great surprises isn't that the Empyrean is the most comfortable, it's how much more comfortable they are than any other headphone in this shootout. It's a considerable amount. The construction and engineering are all way ahead of the other headphones in this shootout. Every time I put the Empyrean on, you just stop and take it in for a second. They really are that good. The others, well, you've got the Utopia, and I appreciate on the Utopia that the headband is thinner, because one thing that bothers me about this suspended arch thing that all the other headphones do is they really do crush down on your hair. Not that I have that much hair up here, but they do crush down on your hair, and it kind of annoys me. It flattens it out. But the one knock on the Utopia is they do clamp a little tight on the head. Now, the Abyss weighs the most and certainly looks the most ridiculous. Frankenstein, anyone? I said this back in the What's in the Box episode. The 1266 is a headphone I once swore I would never own. And look at me now. The Abyss has the wonkiest construction, sure, but the advantage of the 1266 is that they are nearly infinitely tunable, and you can get a wide array of tones based on the orientation of the planar drivers to your ears. The downside to that is that I found myself fussing over the placement on the Abyss more than the others. And these came back from the tune-up in New York corrected, which is to say altered from the positioning I'd spent months fussing over. And I'm still trying to find that sweet spot that I had when I sent them out to get fixed. Now, the STAX has the flimsiest construction. I think I've talked about this enough. I've ranted about the build quality. It's cheap plastic everywhere. And then there's driver flex when they seat on your head, which is this popping effect that all electrostatics do, but it's still startling. You never really get used to it. The ear pads feel cheap, and they make my ears sweat. The ergonomics overall, though, they go to the Empyrean. They're just a cut above this field. But now it's time to begin decoding the sound. Now I'm going to start with Soundstage.
What?
Imagine that. That's a curveball. You weren't expecting that. Now, the Abyss really surprised me. I was not expecting the Soundstage to be as wide as it was by comparison flipping headphones. Now, the Abyss is wide and it is wild. The STAX is sort of close to the Abyss, but it has better control. Now, the Utopia is the most intimate headphone. It has the smallest soundstage to my ears, but even that has its place and purpose. There are tracks the Utopia does better, like, say, Landslide by Fleetwood Mac, because it's this intimate acoustic number. The close proximity gives you a little more emotion out of the song. And the Utopia can kind of confuse you because there's super fast decay in the reverb, and it can trick the ear into thinking that the stage is actually a little wider than it actually is. But in most situations, the STAX and the Abyss scored big with that wide soundstage. I was listening to Jazz at the Pawn Shop, which is a jazz recording done in a small... Well, it's a pawn shop, duh!
Affilliate.
The Abyss just nailed the room size and feel. The Susvara was clean and beautiful, but it sounded a little more maybe studio-like, whereas the Abyss sounded kind of live. The STAX also sounded live, but there was a precision that the Abyss didn't quite have. If I'm choosing one for soundstage, the Abyss and the STAX were kind of ahead of the pack. It's a dead heat between those two with the Susvara right behind them. Detail? It's got to go to the STAX, man. I mean, these things just give you everything with laser precision. They're remarkable. There's no question about that. Now, the Susvara came in a close second, and the Utopia is also quite resolving. The STAX and the Susvara really lead this group, and the Abyss, though, this was the surprise of the group because they produce way less detail than I had anticipated. I thought they'd be like neck and neck with the Susvara. They just weren't once I started jumping between them. Now, I ranked the Utopia third, and the Empyrean was the slowest of the shootout. The one advantage to the Empyrean, though, comparatively anyway, is that they're the most forgiving headphone. So if you've got a source that's a little bit sketch, the Empyrean is a good choice. Let's talk dynamics. I'm talking about that extreme soft to extreme loud effect. You know, The power and the force of the Abyss makes it a dynamics standout. But they're a little bit slower in putting the power down, I gotta say. But the Focal, now that's a terrific headphone for dynamics. And the STAX is like the fastest, but the problem with the STAX is even though it's fast and you can get there, there's not a lot of force behind it, if that makes sense. Now the Susvara is the weakest of the 5, and the Empyrean does surprisingly well despite falling off a little bit in the speed. But if I was picking one for dynamics, I would say go with the Utopia, and the Abyss would be a very close second. Let's talk imaging, because this is one that I struggled with the most, which is odd because normally it's the Soundstage that I have the most angst over. The imaging is the headphone's ability to produce a picture within a 3D soundstage with precision. It's where the instruments are falling within the soundstage. The reason that it's so hard in this shootout is that they all have terrific images. The Empyrean is the only one that maybe comes up a little bit short. They're maybe on the vague side, but each headphone had a slightly different way it approached the image. I would say that I gravitate more towards the Susvara because it's so well sorted, but you can't keep a straight face and say that the image on the STAX is poor, or the Utopia, or the Abyss. But then when I go to pick a headphone for imaging, the Abyss isn't the one I'm going to grab for. So I'm going to call this for the Susvara, but other than the Empyrean, it's difficult to knock the image on any of these headphones. Next up, I'm going to talk about a new category, and I'm calling it instrumentation. And what this is the headphone's accuracy in reproducing an instrument's sound, how lifelike they sound to the actual instrument in the room. And I think the Susvara and STAX really nail pianos and horns and wind instruments. And both are sensational when it comes to vocals. Along with the Utopia and the Susvara sound the best on stringed instruments. I'm talking about guitars, cellos. And the Utopia and the Abyss are better with rhythm instruments, talking about the bass and the drums. But I'd also add that the Abyss sounds great with an acoustic guitar. The Empyrean does a good job overall, but they're a step behind the top 4 because they lack the speed and the resolution that the others do to bring a lifelike sense of an instrument playing right in the room with you. Each has their own individual strengths, but I would say that the Susvara is the most flexible of the group, giving you the most lifelike feel to the widest variety of instruments and vocals. So now we're going to talk about sound structure. And that means we're going to be talking about treble and bass and the middle frequency performance. And I want to make a quick observation up front about the Abyss. Now, the deeper I got into this shootout, it began to occur to me that one of the Abyss weaknesses, not a flaw, but a weakness in this company, is those transition zones between the bass and the mids and the mids and the treble. Now, this is an area that the Susvara, the Focal, and the Empyrean just nail. Very smooth as we move between those frequency ranges. On the STAX, maybe a little less or so because of the diminished bass presence, but I tend to stick to only 3 components in most of these shootouts, but because we're running in this amazing team of rivals, it's important to note those transition zones, and the Abyss struggles with these more than the others. But with that in mind, let's get into those specifics. Starting with the bass, and well, it's the Abyss here. Let's face it, the bass runs deep and powerful with thundering slam. I never tire of talking about how great the Abyss's bass is. Another benefit to the Abyss is you can coax a number of bass effects out of the headphones based on the driver orientation and how they tilt towards your ear. Now the STAX, not surprisingly, has the weakest bass of this bunch, but it produced better down low than I frankly expected, and I was shocked by how much bass the Empyrean threw out comparatively, with decent slam too. Now, maybe it was a bit on the boomy side and less coherent, but I wasn't expecting the bass amount that they had. They were competitive. The Susvara had maybe a more beautiful bass as opposed to a thick attacking bass. Not quite as fun or as slammy as, say, the Abyss or the Utopia, or even the Empyrean for that matter. The mids, to me, were the trickiest to break down. The STAX is a standout and top contender here. You'd think the Susvara might run away with the mids, given their speed and all that, but there's a little bit of a hollowness that colors the upper mids. They can run a little bit thin sounding on some tracks. It's sort of a metallic-y kind of timbre. It's unique to the Hifiman sound. My HE-1000 had it too. Some people love it, some don't. The STAX have supreme mids, but they're definitely analytical. The Utopia, again, spectacular mids, but they're not class leading here, but certainly score high enough. The Abyss's mids have an ethereal quality to them, but they can get a little nasally at times, and that's something I never noticed until I started A-Bing the headphones. They just weren't up to what the other headphones did. The female vocals weren't as strong on the Abyss for sure. Now, the Empyrean has a little bit of a weakness here because that speed, it kills them in the mids. They just don't resolve enough to hang with this elite bunch. Now, between the Susvara and the STAX, I'm going to give the edge to the Susvara. It's just a little bit smoother and a little more pleasant, but again, noting that thinner timbre, you might like the STAX here. And that leaves Treble. Now, the STAX, you think, would easily win this category, but the Susvara kind of gets in the way. The Abyss is a little short on detail and a touch shouty at times even to pull off a win here. The Empyrean has even less detail than the Abyss. They're downright slow comparatively. The Utopia has that darker sound signature, but they burst through with a little bit of sparkle on the top layer that consistently surprises. Now, I'm going to call the treble for the STAX because the speed and the treble makes it super fun to listen to with all the micro detail happening, but the Susvara is very close because they're just so pleasant. Let's talk about some surprises. These are things that I heard that I wasn't expecting. Now, the first is that the Empyrean wasn't left in the dust by the other headphones. I fully expected to be remarkably less impressed after auditioning the other four, or to be blown away by what came after this headphone because of a massive jump in something. Now, it is a technically inferior headphone to the others in this lineup, but it wasn't the dramatic jump I thought it would be. In short, they're the most impractical of this group of headphones, even if they are priced a little bit beyond their worth, in my opinion. Another surprise, speaking of enjoyment, the STAX were the least enjoyable. Go figure. They're one of the least forgiving headphones in this shootout. It's garbage in and garbage out with these. They're the anti-Empyrean in a lot of ways. The STAX won't win this shootout. There are just too many compromises. But on classical and jazz in particular, you can get lost in their sound. Another surprise was the highs and the lows of the Abyss, and sure, it dominated the bass, of course it did, but I wasn't expecting the Abyss to fall so short of detail compared to the STAX and the Susvara, at least to my ears. Now, the Abyss was also prone to getting shouty, but then on the other side, it had the widest soundstage, so it really was a mix of hot and cold, and the imaging was maybe a little worse than I expected. But where this headphone really starts to fall short is that sometimes it sounds like it doesn't stitch the sound together very well. Sometimes it sounds like you're listening to a sum of all the music's parts rather than one coherent presentation of music. Now, there's a quality to these, though, that is a big show. And I love a big show. The Focal is the most reliable headphone. The surprise of the Focal is how well it does in all of the categories, except maybe Soundstage. But it's the headphone that is the least likely to disappoint you. And it might be described as the best all-around headphone. Because the word that pops into my head on this headphone is competent. You want slam? It's got it. Detail? Got it too. Great bass? Sure. Got treble? Got you covered. But it doesn't lead in any of these categories either. The Susvara has that lower treble, upper mid timbre that comes across as maybe a little thin or metallic or lacking some impact on some tracks. It's just a couple of points in the frequency range, but they do present a little discoloration or coloration, depending on how you see things. The Susvara's bass is represented well. It just maybe lacks a little bit of slam. But in most areas, the Susvara was at or near the top. I can't exactly call that a surprise when they cost $6,000. Now we got to talk about a little music. It is a shootout. So Macy Gray's Stripped was the first album that I found that truly showed me the full capabilities of the STAX S009s. Before that recording, when I was doing more traditional rock or country or pop, the STAX seemed like it was kind of looking for a purpose in this field of flagships. But when I put Macy Gray through the STAX, they lit up. The speed, the soundstage, detail, imaging, the STAX was just lit. It all came together. The Focal, of course, was perfectly at home with this album. It lacked maybe a touch of the top-end detail and sparkle of the STAX, but the Susvara was right there for sure. The Abyss struggled with this recording probably the most, comparatively, and the Empyrean just didn't have the technical chops to handle what the recording had to offer. Next up is Carly Simon's No Secrets. First, if you want to test reverb, this album is dripping in it, and a bunch of different types too. There's a lot of acoustic guitar, piano, high vocal that'll test and challenge any headphone. You get huge strings, good bass. The only thing maybe missing is like elaborate percussion, and there isn't a lot of electric guitar other than You're So Vain. It's a song that the Rolling Stones' Mick Jagger accompanies if you listen. It's going to ruin the song forever if you didn't know that. It's a collab that was made up very much on the spot if the reports are true. Mick had a thing for Carly, and he called up the studio, and she told him she was working on backup vocals for one of her songs and asked him to come down and sing with her. Done deal. Well, Mick was never credited for that work. This album works best on the Susvara and the Utopia. The STAX is pretty close, and I enjoyed it on the Empyrean. The Abyss, though, really had a hard time with Carly's voice. Harry Connick Jr. When Harry Met Sally. This is the album that put Harry on the map. It's a soundtrack. It's tied to a great movie. The album went double platinum. Director Rob Reiner approached Harry about scoring his romantic comedy. He thought Harry sounded like a young Frank Sinatra. Pretty good assessment. Harry himself arranged the charts, so impressive, and there are a few songs that were recorded with just his trio. The recording itself, crazy good. It Had to Be You opens with a massive big band, but it's the smaller tracks like Our Love Is Here to Stay. Those trio numbers have terrific percussion that'll challenge your senses. The album won 2 Grammys. Harry's voice is perfect, piano playing is in top form, and he's got a world-class band around him. And the recording is just outstanding. What a journey. The Susvara was a standout, but for me, the Abyss's soundstage gave me a lifelike representation. It's awesome. You feel like you're in the room with the band. The STAX had all the detail and the presence, but I really missed the sub bass on this one. You know, as great as the separation is, it just feels like it lacks impact. The Empyrean, if it just had more detail, would have taken this album hands down because tonally and spatially, it's perfect. The Focal now did everything that the Empyrean did, but with better speed. But for this one, the Abyss takes it for me. So folks, we're down to it. Now the STAX would be a perfect headphone if I didn't like classic rock, and my focus was jazz and classical. The STAX is a remarkable headphone. There is no headphone that can deliver the transients that the STAX pulls off. Those tiny little triangle taps buried in the mix, everything is laid there and bare for better or worse. They show you everything. But the thing is, I love a sub bass, and it's just not there on the STAX. What they do well, they do better than any other headphone, no question. And I get what other people love about the STAX, but these rank in the bottom of my collection, and they're going to get sold. The Empyrean. It's the technically challenged kid in this team of rivals. It just cannot do what the others can do. Yet, I'm keeping them because they're so darn comfortable. Maybe I'll replace them with the Elite down the road, but I still grab these when I'm doing other things and my focus isn't on the technical ability of a headphone. Imagine that, listening to music for fun. If I just want to stream some music from any quality, from any source, the Empyrean is a great choice. But they are priced out of their league. These are more $2,000 to $2,500 headphones, not $3,000. The Abyss. I expected the Abyss to be the front runner, and maybe even the winner, based on my prior listening experiences. I mean, I have spent hours and hours with them, solidly enjoying them along the way. On their own, I was blown away by the Abyss. That bass is so intoxicating. But once I started comparing the components of the music and comparing things like detail retrieval and the treble being an issue compared to its rivals, and they aren't as fast as I originally thought when I did the sound check, this shootout made me look at the Abyss in a whole new light, and I see them now as more of a wild child. They're the headphone that just kind of goes for it, but sometimes doesn't quite make the leaps it's attempting. So I am genuinely surprised to tell you that I will be letting the Abyss go. Now, I do want to hear the revision, the TC, or Total Consciousness, to see if the treble was sorted any better and to see if they picked up any speed. But this was the biggest shocker of this shootout for me. The Focal Utopia. Well, it's as solid as the day it was released, but they do lack a little bit of the Soundstage. On the other hand, they have most of the slam of the Abyss. They present better detail and superior dynamics. Their tonal balance leans a little bit to the bass side of things. They're a little bit darker, but then they roar back with that sparkle layer on the top. This is a competent headphone by any standard, and they're staying in the gear locker for now. The Hifiman Susvara. Well, there's nothing really left, guys. Kind of the only thing left here, so no big surprise. Now, they didn't really win any single category, but they were always at the top or near the top, neck and neck with either the Abyss or the STAX or the Utopia. They were comfortable, maybe not as comfortable as the Empyrean, but they're still comfortable, and they present the best overall sound when you consider it stitching together this rich tapestry of all the components that make up the music. I find myself grabbing the Susvara without hesitation the most. The Focal still has a place in the lineup, but the Susvara right now is at the top of it.
That sounds sweet!
So the STAX and the Abyss will be looking for new homes. Again, I expected the STAX to fall, but the Abyss was my predicted winner going in. How certain was I? Well, I sent them all the way to New York for a tune-up. I wouldn't have done that if I expected to turn around and sell them off. So this is a blood cut for me. Ouch. It took weeks of listening for me to come to these conclusions. And these are my conclusions. They may not be yours, and that's okay. I'm telling you, your head begins playing tricks at you when you're auditioning the same track for the 5th time, especially if it's 2:30 in the morning. Did I really hear that? It sounds kind of tinny now, and it didn't really sound tinny before, but after listening to that other headphone, it now kind of sounds kind of tinny, and maybe I shouldn't have dropped that acid before doing this shootout. There were many times when I wondered why I took this challenge on. But I never would have heard what I heard had I not gone through the hours and hours of A/B listening between these 5 headphones. And the number of times I got wires crossed and pulled the sets to the floor, I shudder to think about it. Thank you all for joining me today. It means so much to have you guys stop by. Give this episode a thumbs up if you enjoyed seeing my dream team and checking out the best group of headphones I could gather in one place. Or do the other thing if you'd rather see Dexter show up and enact some revenge. I can't say I blame you either way, but I will see you before you know it.